The sound of bells rolling across the Tiber had barely faded when one of the aides standing near the front of St. Peter's Square noticed something that no one in the Vatican press pool had seen before. Not in recent memory, not in years. The Pope was not on his platform. He was not moving toward his vehicle. He was on the ground. The white cassock was on the stone, and the man it covered was kneeling beside a figure no one else had yet reached. It was 12:23 in the afternoon on May 27th, 2026. The temperature on the square had been climbing since 9 o'clock. By the time the general audience ended, it had reached 31 degrees, and an 81-year-old priest from the south of Italy was lying where he had fallen. Before the story continues, if what you just heard is already pulling you in, please take a moment to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every like, every subscription, and every comment keeps stories like this one alive. Now back to what happened inside the Vatican. It had begun the way so many of the most consequential moments of this pontificate begin. Quietly, in the ordinary press of bodies gathered in an extraordinary place, under a Roman sky so bright it flattened everything beneath it. Father Franco Semeraro and his brother, Father Diego, had arrived in Rome from Martina Franca 2 days earlier. Martina Franca is a small white-walled town in Puglia, the heel of Italy's boot, a place of trulli and olive groves and an ancient Catholic devotion, so deep it has never needed to announce itself. Father Franco was celebrating the 60th year of his priestly ordination. 6 decades since the day he had first raised his hands over an altar. It was not the kind of anniversary that makes the news. It was the kind that makes the man who lived it go very quiet when he speaks of it. He had brought with him a gift for the Pope, an album carefully assembled, containing photographs of the relics of St. Augustine when they had arrived in Martina Franca, roughly 20 years earlier. The Augustinians are the order of Pope Leo XIV. For a man like Father Franco, presenting that album was not simply a courteous gesture. It was a recognition, brother to brother across the centuries, that something shared and sacred ran between his town and the man now seated on the chair of Peter. The procedure at the end of a general audience in St. Peter's Square has not changed in decades. The Pope concludes his catechesis. He descends from the platform. He moves through the gathered crowd in a long, slow passage of handshakes and embraces and photographs, the kind of contact that Vatican protocol once tried to regulate, and the crowd always, inevitably, overwhelms. People press forward. Security forms its invisible walls, and somewhere in the press of bodies, an ordinary encounter happens that neither party will forget. Father Diego and Father Franco had positioned themselves near the front, in the section reserved for priests and clergy, where the Pope's path would bring him close enough to shake hands, close enough for the album to change hands, close enough for 60 years of priesthood to be acknowledged in a moment. They had been standing in the open sun since roughly 9:30 in the morning. 3 hours. 3 hours in 31 degrees in the full exposure of a square that offers almost no shade before the afternoon. Father Diego would turn 82 in June. He had spent the better part of those years in pastoral ministry at the Holy Family Parish in Martina Franca, the kind of long, unbroken service that the Church speaks of in homilies but rarely rewards in any tangible way. No cardinal's red hat, no Roman appointment, no international conference in his name. Just the daily mass, just the parish, just the people who came through the door and needed something that could not be measured. He was still standing when the Pope's procession drew near. He was still standing when Father Franco presented the album and the Pope received it. And then, in the space of a few seconds, he was not standing anymore. The heat takes people differently. It does not always announce itself. It does not always begin with dizziness or a darkening of vision or a warning that can be acted upon in time. Sometimes it simply arrives, and the body decides before the mind can negotiate. Father Diego fell. He fell, as Father Franco would later describe it to Vatican News, quite badly. Not a gentle lowering, a fall, the kind that leaves a man sore for days afterward. The aides closest to the Pope had been trained for this kind of moment. They knew how to form a barrier. They knew how to summon the Vatican medical service without creating a scene. They knew how to manage the optics of a disrupted audience in a square where every mobile phone was a broadcasting device. But before any of that machinery could engage, before any protocol could be invoked, Pope Leo XIV had already moved. He had not waited for someone to inform him. He had not paused to consult. He had descended from whatever ceremonial distance separates a pope from the people around him, and he had knelt down on the stones of St. Peter's Square beside an 81-year-old priest from Puglia who did not yet know who was beside him. Father Diego looked up. He saw the white cassock. He saw the face above it. And according to Vatican News, which reported on the exchange in the hours that followed, his first words were a question, not an expression of gratitude, not a prayer. A question. Your Holiness, is that really you? There is something in that question that rewards attention. Father Diego Semeraro had been a Catholic priest for 56 years. He had celebrated Mass thousands of times. He had administered last rites. He had baptized children who were now adults with children of their own. He had spent his life in the service of a church whose entire sacramental structure rests on the premise that the sacred interrupts the ordinary without warning, that grace arrives in forms that do not announce themselves in advance. And yet, when the Pope knelt beside him on the stones of St. Peter's Square, his first instinct was disbelief. Your Holiness, is that really you? Perhaps the question was simply the confusion of a man who had just fallen and was not yet fully oriented. Perhaps it was the surprise of an octogenarian who had not expected the encounter to go this way. Or perhaps it was something older than surprise, the shock that runs through a person when the world briefly behaves the way the Gospels say it should, and they realise they had not actually believed it would. The Pope shook his hand. He gave him a rosary. He rose. And then the Vatican's ordinary machinery resumed around them. The medical personnel arrived, the crowd was managed, Father Diego was taken to the Vatican emergency room for examinations that would find nothing seriously wrong. He was sore, Father Franco confirmed to Vatican News, but he was fine. He later celebrated Mass. He later had lunch. He carried the rosary. To understand why that image, a man in white kneeling among men in dark suits on the stones of one of the most photographed public spaces on Earth, spread across the world's news networks within hours of occurring, it is necessary to understand what that image was not. It was not staged. The general audience of May 27th, 2026 had not been planned around a narrative of papal humility. There was no communications team that had scripted the moment. There was no advanced coordination with the Semeraro brothers, who had come simply because Father Franco's 60th anniversary seemed like a reason to make the journey, and because the album of St. Augustine's relics seemed like the right gift to bring. The moment was real in a way that institutional gestures are not, because it happened before the institution could respond. This matters more than it might seem, because it arrived in a particular context. Pope Leo XIV had been building a reputation in the 13 months since his election as a pope who thought carefully about the relationship between authority and service, between the office of the papacy and the humility that the Gospels associate with genuine Christian leadership. His Augustinian formation had shaped him in specific ways. Augustine of Hippo, whose order Prevost entered in 1977 and led as Prior General from 2001 to 2013, wrote at length about the temptations of power, the way that positions of leadership can become occasions for the self to expand rather than diminish, the way that service can become performance, the way that even a bishop's throne can be a place of pride dressed in the language of humility. Leo had quoted Augustine directly in his first public appearances as Pope. He had chosen plainness in his personal presentation, no theatrical entrances, no elaborate ceremonials beyond what the liturgy required. His homilies returned repeatedly to meekness as something the Church was called to embody in its institutional life, not merely preach from its altars. But those were words. The stones of St. Peter's Square on the afternoon of May 27th were not words. The image spread first through Italian Catholic media, which had correspondents at the audience. Vatican News published a report within hours, including the account that Father Franco Semeraro had given directly. By the following morning, it had been carried by outlets across Europe, Latin America, and the United States. The reaction divided, as reactions to Leo often divide, along the invisible fault lines that run through contemporary Catholicism. For those who had been watching this pontificate with concern, who worried that its emphasis on synodality and dialogue signalled a weakening of hierarchical clarity, who felt that the papacy required a certain formal distance in order to function as the teaching authority the Church depended upon. The image of Leo kneeling was welcome. Here, at last, was something that looked like the Christ of the Gospels rather than the chairman of a committee. The gesture was humble. The gesture was clear. The gesture did not require interpretation. Conservative commentators who had spent months parsing Leo's statements on the German Church's reform agenda, or his approach to the SSPX crisis, or the question of female appointments to dicasteries, paused their analysis for a day to note that whatever one thought of the pontificate's direction, the man on the ground in St. Peter's Square was not a man performing humility. He was a man practicing it. The progressive wing of the Catholic world read the same image differently and with equal conviction. For those who had been arguing that Leo's papacy represented a genuine departure from the monarchical model of the office, that his emphasis on listening, on the people of God, on what he called in his February address to the clergy of Rome the simple reality of closeness, the image was confirmation. A pope who knelt on stones to help a fallen priest was a pope whose theology was not abstract. It was embodied. It was there, in the cassock on the square, in the hand that shook an 81-year-old's hand before the rosary changed hands, in the question. Your Holiness, is that really you? And the fact that the answer was yes, and the answer required no announcement. What neither camp fully reckoned with, in the hours of commentary that followed, was the specific weight of who Father Diego Semeraro was. Not his importance. He was not important in any institutional sense. He was a parish priest from a town of 49,000 people in southern Italy. He had no Vatican connections. He held no office. He had come to Rome for his brother's anniversary and a set of photographs. His importance was precisely his unimportance. He was the kind of priest the Catholic Church produces by the tens of thousands in every generation. Men who spend their lives in places that do not appear in newspapers, serving people whose names will not be recorded anywhere, doing the work of the Church in the form that the Church most frequently takes, which is not a consistory of cardinals or a papal encyclical, but a visit to a sick parishioner, a mass on a Thursday morning, a conversation in a sacristy that no one will ever report. Father Diego had been ordained in St. Peter's Square in 1970. The man who ordained him was Paul VI, the Pope who had closed the Second Vatican Council's work, who had published Humanae Vitae, who had navigated the Church through one of its most turbulent decades in modern history. 56 years later, Father Diego was back in the same square, and a different Pope was on his knees beside him. By noon on May 28th, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, prefect of the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life, had received a letter from the Pope, transmitted through Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin, on the occasion of a Dicastery meeting dedicated to the pastoral care of the elderly. The letter had been prepared before the events of May 27th, but its language, read in the light of those events, carried a quality that was not accidental. It spoke of old age as a time of grace. It spoke of fragility as having spiritual and communal value. It spoke of the Church's call to propose the gospel message of meekness, humility, and peace, even in a world dominated by the logic of performance and competition. A source familiar with the dicastery's work noted that when the letter was read aloud during the meeting, at least one participant pointed out the coincidence of timing. It was not, the source suggested, received as a coincidence. In Germany, the reaction to the image was layered in ways that the Italian and American commentary did not fully capture. The German Bishops' Conference had been in extended tension with Rome over questions of reform, the synodal way process, the question of blessings for same-sex couples, the ongoing debate about the role of women in church governance. For the German theological establishment, Leo's pontificate was being watched for signs of whether the openness signalled in his early appointments. He had placed a woman, Maria Montserrat Alvarado, as head of the Dicastery for Communication in June 2026. The first female prefect of a dicastery would translate into structural change or remain at the level of gesture. The image from St. Peter's Square was immediately caught up in this debate. Conservative voices in the German Church argued that a pope capable of kneeling for a fallen priest was capable of clarity on doctrine as well as on charity. Progressive voices argued the opposite, that a pope who understood service this viscerally would eventually have to extend the logic of service to the structures of the institution itself. In both cases, the image of Father Diego on the stones had been absorbed into an argument that Father Diego himself had not known he was part of. In Brazil, where the Catholic Church remains the largest in the world by membership, and where Leo's election had been received with particular intensity, the first pope from the Augustinian order, a man with deep roots in Latin American pastoral life through his years in Peru, the image circulated primarily on social media before the institutional news outlets had filed their reports. By the time the Brazilian Bishops' Conference issued a brief statement noting the pastoral beauty of the gesture, the image had already been shared more than 300,000 times on Brazilian platforms. The statement described it as an expression of the Church's vocation to be close to the suffering. It did not say more than that. In Poland, the reaction was quieter and more carefully worded. The Polish bishops had been among the more cautious observers of Leo's pontificate, attentive to its continuities with Francis's approach to synodality, watchful of its implications for the Church's position on questions where Polish Catholic culture held firmly traditional views. The image of the kneeling Pope was acknowledged in Polish Catholic media, but the dominant note was not exuberance. It was something more like relief, the relief of seeing a gesture that did not need to be argued about, that could not be framed as progressive or traditional, that simply was what it appeared to be. One Polish commentator, writing for a Krakow-based Catholic journal, put it plainly. This was a pope who had not forgotten that he was a priest before he was anything else. In the United States, where Leo's election had carried an additional weight of national significance, the first American pope, the Chicago-born son of a family with French and Italian and Spanish roots, a man who had played basketball and studied mathematics before entering the Augustinians, the image arrived into a media environment already primed for strong reactions. American Catholic commentary tends to move faster and more loudly than its European equivalents, and the image of Leo kneeling in St. Peter's Square was no exception. Within 12 hours, it had been analysed by commentators ranging from traditionalist Catholics, who had been uncertain about his pontificate, to progressive Catholics, who had been enthusiastic from the beginning. The unusual feature of the American reaction was that both groups used substantially the same words. Both called the gesture authentic. Both called it moving. Both described it as the kind of thing they had hoped to see from him. There was one voice that did not join the general chorus of commentary on May 27th. It was, characteristically, the Vatican's own. The Holy See Press Office issued no formal statement about the incident. There was no prepared text, no official characterization of what had occurred, no guidance on how it was to be understood. Father Franco's account was available through Vatican News. The images were available through Vatican media. What those images meant, the Vatican seemed to suggest by its silence, was not a question the institution needed to answer. It was self-evident, or it was a private matter, between a pope, a priest, and the stones of a square that both of them had visited before under entirely different circumstances. That silence was itself noticed. A senior curial official, speaking on background to a correspondent for a European Catholic news service, several days after the event, offered a characterization that the correspondent included without attribution in a broader piece about the Leo pontificate's communication style. The official said that Leo's refusal to use a moment of genuine pastoral instinct as an occasion for institutional messaging was, in itself, a form of messaging. That the silence was the statement, and that people who had been watching this pontificate closely were beginning to understand that the gap between what Leo said publicly and what his actions communicated privately was smaller than it appeared, and that closing that gap was for him not a communication strategy, but a matter of personal theology. On the evening of May the 27th, after the general audience had concluded and the square had emptied, and Father Diego Semeraro had been examined and cleared, and had celebrated Mass, and had sat down to lunch in a Vatican dining room that he had not expected to see the inside of when he left Martina Franca 2 days earlier, Pope Leo XIV returned to his private chapel in the Domus Sanctae Marthae. The chapel is small. It has stone walls and plain wooden kneelers and almost no ornamentation. He knelt there for a long time. A member of his personal household, speaking afterward to a journalist from a Roman Catholic weekly, said that on that evening the Pope remained at prayer well past his usual hour. When he finally rose and prepared to leave, he paused at the threshold and said something quietly, as if to himself rather than to the aide waiting outside. What he said, the aide later recounted, was this: "The one who falls reminds us why we are standing." By morning, the commentaries had resumed. The German debates continued. The American analyses multiplied. The Polish journals published their measured assessments. The Brazilian social media feeds moved on to the next story. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in a Vatican administrative office, a document was being prepared. A response to the dicastery meeting on the care of the elderly. A set of pastoral guidelines whose specific contents had not yet been made public, whose implications for how the Church organised its ministry to the aged and the infirm were still being worked through, still being argued about by the people inside the institution, who argue about such things. Whether that document would say anything that the image of May 27th had not already said more clearly than any text could say it. That was a question that no one inside the Vatican had yet answered. Father Diego Semeraro went home to Martina Franca with a rosary in his pocket and a story he would tell for the rest of his life. The square he left was the same square where 56 years earlier another pope had ordained him to the priesthood. What connects those two moments? The man who lays hands on you at the beginning of your ministry and the man who kneels beside you near its end is something the Church has always called grace and has never fully been able to explain. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of what is unfolding inside the Catholic Church right now, please subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you believe Pope Leo XIV will do next. Your support is what makes stories like this possible, and there is much more to come.